Douglas, as you've written a book about it, why don't you define, for the benefit of the audience, and indeed for us here tonight, what neoconservatism actually is?
Sure. Well, it's the important thing to stress, first of all, is that it's not a party. It's not a cabal or a group. Most neocons like myself don't even know each other, we don't meet. It's simply a way of looking at the world. It's an attitude, a perspective on things. I say that one of the defining things about that is that it's a mixture of realism and idealism. Now, that may not sound so odd, but I think that in the current climate today it is very odd. On the one hand, we have a lot of conservatives, people from the right, who distrust idealism, are deeply suspicious of it and of social engineering of any kind, whether at home or abroad. And on the other hand, there are, of course, the modern-day leftists, liberals as they're called in the States, who simply refuse to see the world how it is. So it is quite rare.
Quite rare.
But are more associated with conservatism that someone like Douglas would argue for.
I should, yes, of course, Douglas. I did say earlier that actually it's a foreign policy element we're looking at, and I know we have a domestic side to it. You will obviously come onto a different side to Oliver on that purpose, on the domestic.
On domestic, but
yes.
The interesting thing about neoconservatism is that it's bridged a gap between left and right, as it were, and centrists in recent decades. Oliver's quite right to say that it's sort of grown up recently and has splintered. I mean, in some ways, neoconservatives have always been a sort of splintered movement, if you can call them a movement. They have always, Irving Kristol, one of the founders, really, of neoconservative thought, said in the 60s, you know, if you put 3 neoconservatives in a room, the likelihood is that they're going to disagree more than they're going to agree. As I said, it backs up my notion that, I mean, apart from being a philosophy and things which you can trace, it's also just an attitude which is in some ways undefinable.
Right. The position that Mr. Blair came to long before President Bush came to office was that there is a progressive imperative for humanitarian intervention where repressive states cannot reasonably be said to hold sovereignty, where they don't represent the captive peoples under their sway. That is, in my view, a neoconservative position. It's one that I'm not surprised conservatives would balk at. That's precisely my point. I think he expresses in that position a traditional commitment to the orthodoxy of British social democracy and liberalism.
So yes, so he is a neocon.
In foreign policy, not in domestic
policy. Yes. Douglas?
The perfect neocon.
The perfect neocon.
Absolutely. What people call the Bush doctrine is nonsensical. It's not the Bush doctrine at all. It's the Blair doctrine. Always was. Mr. Bush was late on to this, really. You could argue that it took him till 9/11 to become, in any way, neocon. In 98, 99 and 2000, Bush, on the campaign trail in America, was arguing a very isolationist stance. It was Blair, really, in Kosovo, which was the most important action that set the trend, and after Sierra Leone, that really showed the American administration the way. So no, it's the Blair doctrine, and I think he should be very proud of that. I don't know if he is, but
I agree. I'm sorry.
A strong moral underpinning, which is sort of guiding what he wants to do. And
it's worth stating, of course, Mr. Blair got on just as well with President Clinton.
Didn't really do God at all, did he?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, no, that's a misunderstanding. Mr. Clinton did God
Possibly
a lot.
the only person.
I mean, you remember when Mr. Clinton came to his prayer breakfast and just during the Monica Lewinsky scandal, his Bible under his hand, a very, very convenient positioning there, not for the first time. And but no, I mean, Clinton and Blair got on very well. Bush and Blair got on very well. And Mr. Blair is very good at getting on with our allies, whether they're Democratic or Republican.
It's to achieve the ends of regime change, and there are means other than war. I'm not a peacenik. I'm not one of these people who says never war, but that it should be as a last resort. And I think the
you
war
have
that
to
we've
agree
gone
that after 15 years it was a last resort. It was hardly a hurtle to war in 2003. Saddam Hussein had been given a fair amount of time.
There was a very...
I didn't see a rush.
Let's talk about the realism of what we've done in Iraq. We've taken one of the most notably secular states in the Middle East and turned it into a training ground for fundamental Islamic
not a secular
terrorists.
state. It was an Islamist sponsoring.
And it was a training ground for religious fanaticism.
But I mean, simply on the realist grounds, I mean, this is what we have to come back to, is the interesting thing that happened after 9/11 in the American administration, and I think has happened here. is that, I mean, neocons haven't taken over the world or haven't even got much sway in many parts of government here in America. But what has happened is that the realists, the Cheneys and the Rumsfelds, have understood that it is no longer realistic to be propping up regimes in the Middle East which make the inhabitants of those countries hate you, and which you end up feeling the effects of on the streets of New York and in the streets of London. That's not, if there's any realism in that, where is it? If there was any realism in the Kissingerian policy of that, I've yet to see it.
So in your view, we need it because it's the only viable strategy?
The only viable strategy, aside from being the only moral strategy, it's the only viable strategy for there not being, in the years to come, continual blowback from propping up regimes which neither we nor the occupants of Middle Eastern countries want to be treating with.
But where is the realism of riding roughshod over international opinion through multilateral organisations?
What does international opinion mean? International opinion means nothing when it's the UN. It means nothing when it's international law. It means nothing when you've got a country like Cuba.
It means that we couldn't imagine a situation now where President Bush or Tony Blair took their respective countries to war because the international opinion is so highly stacked against them because of the way they did it.
Sovereign armies can't go to war from Britain and America because of international... What is this international?
We're getting a resurgence of xenophobia, and there is a commitment on both sides of the political spectrum in Germany to fashion or to reassert the values of a so-called militant democracy against it.
Douglas, any thoughts?
Well, I agree. I think that it's always a concern when there's a sort of re-eruption of this kind of sentiment in Europe. I suspect strongly in Germany, as in France in recent years, that the popular opinion and opinion from all major political parties will see this off. I mean, it's never good to be sanguine about the threat from the far right in Europe, but I don't see it as being the threat that some people do at the moment. I think it's been seen off significantly enough, and I think that at the moment there are enough people who are willing to see it off.
Even though the far-right party in Austria just got 11% of the vote.
Well, yeah, Austria's not a happy example.
Let's lead on into your stories. I think you've got something...
Oh, yeah, I thought one of the interesting stories of the week was the story that made it into one of the British papers, but got very heavily covered in the blogosphere, which was the news of continuing riotings, not really the news, of riotings in the north of Paris. With 14,
I didn't hear a word of that.
14 police officers each day being injured. Police officers in Paris are now demanding that they have armoured vehicles to go into some of these suburbs. Of course, this really demonstrates, to my mind, the reason why it's an important story, I think, is it demonstrates that much of the activity of our time isn't just erupting in single bursts. It's ongoing narratives, to use that dreadful word of the left. And the narrative of France really is a state and a government which is slowly losing control of significant parts of its country. And the Islamic suburbs of Paris demonstrate this. It wasn't just something from last fall in Paris. It wasn't a one-off. This has been going on for many years now. And I think demonstrates that the French government is losing control of its own territory.
The UN must now show that it can act to prevent rogue nations from doing as they please. A failure to adopt mandatory and enforceable sanctions will not only highlight the UN's impotence yet again and allow this madman to develop his capabilities, but will also give encouragement to other dangerous regimes such as Iran to do likewise. A fair assessment, Douglas?
Well, I mean, you referred to the UN limbering up. I mean, I sort of see it as sort of staggering or perhaps festering up. I don't see the UN doing anything. It's so late in the day for the UN. It's just incredible and really demonstrates one of the appalling things about that organization. That, I mean, a country, a rogue state like North Korea, sets off a nuclear test successfully, and the UN meets in an emergency session to talk about possible sanctions. I mean, this is pathetic, quite frankly.
Typical UN